Joining me now is Ken Klippenstein, now of The Nation. Hey, Ken, how you doing?
Hey, just want to let you know, no hard feelings there.
No, obviously not. All right, congrats on the new job, actually. Ken, you wrote a story about Bloomberg Campaign NDA. So first, tell us what that is.
So the Bloomberg campaign has its staffers sign a non-disclosure agreement. That's a confidentiality agreement, which makes it so that it, is a civil violation for them to disclose things that are going on in the campaign. And for some things that makes sense. So, for example, if you're financing internal polling, you don't want that to get out. So I understand that. But if you look at the language of the contract that was leaked to me, what it shows is that they can't discuss hardly anything about the campaign, and that is a serious threat to the public being able to know what's going on, not just during the campaign, but this agreement goes on indefinitely. So that's going to make it really hard for reporters to figure out, in retrospect, what may have happened or not happened.
So I guess there's two different things here, because NDAs are fairly normal in the business world. I know some now say maybe they shouldn't be, but they are. So one is, this is not the business world, this is a campaign. Is that a difference? And then secondly, is there something about this NDA that's more exhaustive than a normal NDA?
Yeah, well, what's interesting about the NDA is I ran it by a government watchdog group that commented, and they're familiar with campaigns, and the distinction you draw between campaigns and businesses is right, because in the private corporate world, these are perfectly common. However, in campaigns, they're less common, and what's more about this confidentiality agreement is that it's extremely detailed, very long, and very broadly applied. So it would cover much more than what you would ordinarily see. What I was told is that most confidentiality agreements in the context of campaigns are much shorter. Many are even just a few sentences long, covering just the basics. Don't talk to the press, don't go through proper channels, so on and so forth. And they also have a duration where they'll expire. None of that is true of this confidentiality agreement. And what's more is there's a section on it that makes it so that you can't report. It would essentially, the language of it makes it difficult for if you were to report workplace abuse, so things like sexual harassment, racial discrimination, those sorts of things. It does have a carve out for disclosing those things in the context of a court, like if you're subpoenaed or testimony is requested. But the fact of the matter is that it usually doesn't get to that level. So this is going to have a chilling effect on their employees. And the context of all of this is that Bloomberg has had a bunch of NDAs, had women sign NDAs, not just personally with respect to allegations against himself individually, but for his company as well. So that's sort of the context that all this arises in.
So yeah, well, that's what I was going to get to. So one more thing about that. Well, why do we think this is? Do we think that it is because he comes from the corporate world and so he's just applying it to a campaign? Do we think it's the 40 different cases of sexual harassment at Bloomberg? And by the way, the company's got his name on it. Doesn't mean he did the sexual harassment. It also doesn't mean that makes it any better. But might that be the context here? Or they're paying up people a lot of money, and Bloomberg is famously, tries to guard his privacy. I'm going to say, I suppose if you have $57 billion, you'd do that. But I suppose you'd probably want to do that if you didn't, if you had 57 bucks. But that doesn't necessarily make it right either. But what do we think is driving this?
I think you're exactly right. It looks to me, and this is what my sources are kind of hinting at too, that he's exporting a business strategy that he's used in the corporate world and is trying to apply that to governance. And who does that remind you of? That reminds me of Donald Trump. And the government watchdog group that I spoke with about this NDA actually said that Donald Trump used a similar NDA, and that was the cause of a lot of controversy in 2017, or I think it was 2016 for his campaign. And so I think what you're seeing is an attempt to move government, which is historically and just rationally supposed to be something that has more transparency than matters of private affairs, and adopt a sort of corporate worldview in how you handle these things, and that is just that that might work in business, but that is just very corrosive to the kind of sunlight that we require, I think, of our government to just know what the hell's going on.
Yeah, that's actually a good transition to talking about the campaign in general, because to me, the thing that struck me was both Trump and Bloomberg use legal avenues as almost a form of bullying. So now there's a lot of talk about, oh my God, do Bernie Sanders supporters on Twitter that are unverified, do they bully people, right? But the reality is when you have a ton of money, like Trump does, he says, for example, I'm gonna hide all my grades, and if anybody tries to find my high school grades even, I will sue them, and they won't be able to afford the lawsuit, so I'll bankrupt them for trying to find out what a dummy I am. And Bloomberg uses his money and legal team in a similar way. Is that, in a sense, a way of intimidating not just people who work for them, but maybe also the press as well? You better be careful with Mike Bloomberg, otherwise he'll come after you with his army of lawyers.
Oh yeah, and my sources within the campaign who I worked with, and there were several of them. This wasn't just one person. They all described a mood of anxiety and fear, frankly, about a figure that they perceive as enormously powerful, and an agreement that they signed that they're worried, you don't really know what it applies to because it's so broad. So, aside from what are the literal consequences of this agreement that people in the campaign signed, there's also the psychological effect of, geez, this looks pretty scary. There's a guy with a whole pile of money that he's sitting on top of, and all these complicated, legal resources at his disposal, and all of that is just, I think, runs contrary to what is supposed to be the spirit of government, which is openness, so that we can debate and question things.
So Ken, actually, it reminds me of something else that happened in Bloomberg Media. I used to know someone that worked there, and what she said is the good news was that Bloomberg would overpay you by about 10 to 20% above market, and everybody knew that. But then once you got an apartment or a house based on that, you were hooked. And everyone there was hooked. And they knew that if they went to a different job, they couldn't afford their apartment or their mortgage, et cetera. And then they would put in really restrictive rules, and there'd be no debating anything, right? I mean, it's not, which, in a normal workplace environment, you don't get to debate your manager. But she had worked in many different places and said this was just absolutely oppressive. But if you ever complained, they'd be like, well, okay, we're overpaying you, so what are you gonna do? And in this case, I've heard that the staffers are getting up to $140,000, which is unheard of in the campaign world. So does that appear to be the same strategy he used at Bloomberg Media?
100%, Cenk. I mean, that is uncanny what you just described, because without getting into sourcing and the individuals I work with for this particular article, I've gotten to know a whole bunch of people on the campaign. They're a leaky bunch because a lot of them don't believe in it, because they're doing it because they'll source out to these young folks that need work desperately, and this is something that provides them not just that, but something that they can survive off of. And so that is something I'm hearing again and again and again, and suggests to me that Bloomberg is purchasing a campaign rather than attracting people to his ideology or what his worldview may be for improving the country.
No, I've talked to progressive staffers who've gone to Bloomberg because they're like, what can I do? I mean, it's just too much money. And even if he loses, he's gonna pay me for the rest of the year. But what that means is they're all mercenaries. And so when you've got mercenaries, then you have to put a tougher NDA on them. Otherwise, they're gonna tell folks the questionable stuff you might be up to. So that's part of it. Now, I wanted to just talk a little bit more broadly about the campaign, because I've noticed a phenomenon, but you're following it closer, that a lot of the damaging stuff about Bloomberg seems to be reported by non-traditional press. So Benjamin Dixon finds the tape on Stop and Frisk. You've got Laura Bassett, who used to work at HuffPost for a long time. She's at GQ now, but there's not a lot of New York Times stories that seem to be breaking on Bloomberg, and he was the mayor for 3 terms in New York. You'd think the New York Times would be all over it. Are you seeing that same disparity between national media being way softer on Bloomberg and the rest of the media actually exposing the stuff that he's done?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a few factors I think at play here. One is that Bloomberg is sort of like with the campaign, the news media company is one of the few to offer people pretty good pay in a field that is very competitive and seems to only get worse over time. So I'm speculating, but I would imagine that people thinking about their careers and their livelihoods are going to be hesitant to across one of the places that is one of the very few that you can make a decent living at this kind of work. That's one factor. Another is just that Bloomberg is a huge media conglomerate. Completely aside from the people that it employs, it is helping to set the agenda. Cenk, I saw a headline that described Bloomberg and Bernie as the only two frontrunners at this point, and that was published by Bloomberg News. I can't think of a better illustration of the problems with concentration of power in media that we have now.
Yeah, so that's really powerful what Ken is explaining there. And I saw this when I worked at MSNBC. A third of the people in the building had already worked at Fox News. Another third had friends who worked at Fox News, and the other third were looking forward to working at Fox News. That's why the rest of cable news never criticized Fox News, because their livelihood either was tied to it or could be tied to it in the future. And so if you're in New York Times or Washington Post, you're thinking, Bloomberg's my lifeboat. And one last thing, Ken, real quick. I don't know that Bloomberg Media makes any money. He makes all of his money from the terminals. So Bloomberg Media might be a giant marketing arm. And so, hey, look, not only do I get to buy a whole media company that puts out my marketing to protect my $57 billion or whatever he's up to, but I also get to influence the rest of the press. Hey, one day you might get that jackpot at Bloomberg Media, so you better be good to me. So I get that that's a phenomenon. I guess my question there is, do you have any idea if Bloomberg Media actually makes money on its own, or is it a loss leader for marketing purposes?
I don't know for certain, and so much of this stuff is sort of a black box with finance generally. But I don't think it's unreasonable to kind of presume that the financial side of his conglomerate, because it's really two parts, as you say. One is financial, not just the terminals, but instruments generally. And then the other side of it is the media side. And so I think what we're seeing is sort of Trump on steroids, in the sense of Trump had a prefab media identity that helped him run. And now we have someone who has a prefab media empire, which is completely different and sort of uncharted waters that I think we find ourselves in now.
Yeah, interesting times. And he's much more subtle and much smarter than Trump. So that's also something to look out for. All right, Ken Klippenstein from The Nation. Thank you so much. We appreciate it, brother.
Great to talk to you.
And by the way, is that the lavender sweater? Is it back?
It sure is. I brought it back just for you.
All right, well, good to see that too. All right, thanks, Ken.
All right, take care.
Yeah, that's the sweater that lit the internet on fire. Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.